Iran allegedly humiliated the United States military while Pentagon officials attempted to portray the incident as a success. The report centers on events said to have occurred in the Arabian Sea involving an Iranian Shahed-139 drone that reportedly flew about 500 miles from Iran's southern coast, penetrated multiple layers of U.S. naval defenses, approached within range of the USS Abraham Lincoln, gathered reconnaissance intelligence, transmitted that data back to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and was then shot down by an F-35C fighter jet after the transmission was complete. Iranian state media, including the Tasnim news agency, was cited as confirming that the Shahed-139 sent its reconnaissance and identification images to a command center before communications were lost. The claim is that the drone completed its intelligence mission before it was destroyed, and that the U.S. response amounted to shooting down an aircraft after its operational purpose had already been fulfilled. The USS Abraham Lincoln was described as a Nimitz-class supercarrier, roughly 1,000 feet long, displacing more than 100,000 tons, carrying about 90 aircraft, and operating with a crew of approximately 5,630 sailors. The carrier was described as being protected by guided missile destroyers, advanced radar, electronic warfare systems, and fighter aircraft on constant alert. The account argues that despite this layered defense, a low-cost Iranian drone was able to approach close enough to collect intelligence on the carrier's position, defensive posture, air operations, escort vessels, and vulnerabilities, and transmit that information back to Iran in real time. U.S. Central Command was described as presenting the incident as evidence of effective defense. A spokesman, Captain Tim Hawkins, was quoted as saying the drone approached aggressively with unclear intent and that the F-35C shot it down in self-defense to protect the carrier and personnel on board. The account disputes that framing, emphasizing the distance the drone reportedly traveled and arguing that the flight duration should have provided opportunities for earlier detection and interception. It presents two possibilities. Either U.S. systems failed to detect the drone until it was close to the carrier, or the drone was detected but could not be engaged effectively until after it had completed its intelligence collection. The account characterizes both scenarios as damaging for U.S. naval security. The account then describes a second incident, said to have occurred hours later. Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps speedboats allegedly launched another drone, identified as a Mahajer, and harassed an American-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Two Iranian IRGC boats were said to have approached the tanker Stena Impero at high speed and ordered it to stop and prepare to be boarded. The tanker's crew was said to have refused and increased speed. A U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer, identified as the USS McFall, was said to have moved in to escort the tanker, after which the Iranian boats broke off their approach. Based on these two events, the account argues that Iran demonstrated the ability to conduct low-cost reconnaissance against a U.S. carrier strike group and to pressure commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz in a way that forces the U.S. Navy to divert assets to protect individual vessels. It describes this as asymmetric warfare and claims Iran is gaining advantage through these tactics. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was described as addressing the incidents on Fox News, saying Central Command acted appropriately while emphasizing that President Trump remained committed to diplomacy. The account challenges the idea that the carrier deployment reflects diplomacy, describing the positioning of the USS Abraham Lincoln as military pressure. It further claims Trump deployed what was described as an armada to the region, including the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, 3 additional destroyers, 3 other combat ships, and roughly 7,000 additional U.S. troops to pressure Iran into negotiations.
The response was described as Iran's alleged ability to penetrate defenses with a reconnaissance drone, collect intelligence on vulnerabilities, and transmit that information back before being stopped. The Shahed-139 was described as a mass-produced reconnaissance platform that Iran can manufacture domestically for roughly $20,000 and as resembling an MQ-9 Predator in general profile. The account emphasizes that in this concept of operations, the drone does not need to survive. It only needs to approach close enough to collect intelligence and transmit it, after which losing the platform is acceptable. It repeats the claim that Iranian state media confirmed transmission of reconnaissance and identification imagery before communications were lost. The claim is that the drone completed its intelligence mission before it was destroyed, and that the U.S. response amounted to shooting down an aircraft after its operational purpose had already been fulfilled. The account asserts that this intelligence would be useful for planning further action, including potential attacks involving anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or massed drone and fast-boat swarms. It describes this as asymmetric warfare and claims Iran is gaining advantage through these tactics. Iranian state media was confirmed transmission of reconnaissance and identification imagery before communications were lost. The assertion is that Iranian commanders would now possess valuable intelligence on the carrier's location, defensive configuration, escort vessel placement, and operating patterns. This intelligence would be useful for planning further action, including potential attacks involving anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or massed drone and fast-boat swarms. The account also claims the mission would have tested U.S. reaction timelines and procedures, including how long it took to respond, which systems engaged, and whether there were delays in launching aircraft. The account argues that the incident exposes a broader weakness. U.S. carrier defenses are designed primarily for sophisticated threats, such as aircraft and missiles, rather than slow, low-cost reconnaissance drones that may not present an immediate strike profile. The report highlights a cost imbalance, stating that shooting down the drone required deploying an F-35C, described as a roughly $110 million fighter, to use cannon fire against a platform described as costing about $20,000. The argument is that if Iran sends large numbers of such drones, the U.S. faces an unfavorable economic and operational problem, forcing hard choices between expending expensive resources, risking intelligence leakage, or allowing some drones through to preserve capacity for other threats. Military analyst Behnam Bentaleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies was cited as calling the incident a test, described as Iran revisiting maritime harassment tactics near the Strait of Hormuz and measuring Trump's willingness to use military force across a range of Iranian threats. The account then argues that Trump's public comments indicated caution. It says rather than authorizing retaliatory strikes, he told reporters that talks with Iran were ongoing and that the outcome would be seen. This is characterized as hesitation.
Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian was described as responding by instructing Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to pursue fair and equitable negotiations with the United States, but only if a suitable environment exists. The account interprets this as Iran signaling willingness to negotiate while seeking reduced military pressure. It describes this as Iran using the prospect of negotiations to deter retaliation for provocative actions, and claims the approach has been effective because Trump has not struck Iranian military targets despite prior threats. The report claims the USS Abraham Lincoln is operating about 500 miles from Iranian waters, describing this as far enough to complicate Iranian coastal targeting, but also far enough to impose longer flight times and reduced loiter duration for U.S. aircraft.
It characterizes that positioning as a retreat framed as repositioning, and argues Iran is continuing to test limits to determine where U.S. red lines are. The tanker incident is used to argue that the Strait of Hormuz remains a persistent vulnerability because of its geography and proximity to Iranian coastal bases. The account notes the strait's narrowest point as about 21 miles wide and argues that Iranian speedboats can harass shipping and return to Iranian waters quickly. It claims protecting every tanker would require continuous patrols by multiple destroyers at high cost, while still leaving exposure to larger-scale swarm tactics. The report argues that these dynamics reflect a broader strategic imbalance. It states that Iran operates close to home, with short supply lines and extensive coastal defenses, while the United States operates far from home, with long supply lines, limited basing options, and political sensitivity to casualties. It then assesses Trump's Iran strategy as failing. The account says Trump has spent weeks threatening strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, deploying what it calls the largest U.S. regional buildup since the Iraq War, issuing ultimatums on Iran's nuclear program, missiles, and support for regional proxies, and then encountering an Iranian response defined by drone reconnaissance near U.S. naval assets and harassment of shipping. It argues that Iran is offering negotiations while refusing to discuss missiles or regional activities, creating a situation in which Trump faces two unfavorable choices: launching strikes that could trigger a wider war, or backing down and losing credibility. The account argues that the drone incident worsens both options. If strikes occur, it claims Iran now has better intelligence to support retaliation against the carrier strike group. If strikes do not occur, it claims Iran learns it can conduct reconnaissance and harassment without meaningful consequences beyond the loss of disposable systems. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was cited as acknowledging the dilemma, saying military action must be evaluated in terms of whether it achieves objectives or triggers a costly open-ended conflict. Retired Admiral James Stavridis was cited as warning about the asymmetry of using high-cost platforms to counter low-cost threats, stating the math does not work long-term. The report reiterates the claim that Iran can produce Shahed-139 drones for roughly $20,000 each and can build them in large numbers, arguing that a scenario involving dozens of drones would force the United States to spend far more to counter them. The report asserts that Trump has not authorized strikes despite strong rhetoric, repeatedly suggesting decisions will be made soon, and claims this indicates advisors may be warning that costs and risks outweigh benefits. It also describes problems with planned negotiations, stating that Iran initially agreed to talks in Istanbul, then demanded a move to Muscat, and that Iranian officials are willing to discuss nuclear issues but refuse negotiations on missiles or regional activities. The account describes this as incompatible with Trump's stated aim of a comprehensive agreement addressing all three issues. The conclusion presented is that the situation has become a dangerous standoff, with U.S. forces on high alert, Iran continuing to probe defenses and test resolve, and neither side wanting war, while also refusing to back down from conflicting positions. The report argues that each probe yields additional information about U.S. capabilities and limits, and describes the drone approach toward the USS Abraham Lincoln as a signal that Iran can reach U.S. carriers at distance, collect intelligence on their defensive posture, and complete reconnaissance missions before U.S. forces can prevent the information transfer. The account rejects the idea that the incident was a U.S. victory, describing it instead as a strategic setback masked by a tactical shootdown. It claims Pentagon officials are emphasizing that no personnel were hurt and no equipment was damaged to shift attention away from the broader implication that Iran was able to gather intelligence by penetrating U.S. defenses. The final question posed is what Iran will do with the information and whether Trump will acknowledge that military threats are not producing the intended results and that negotiations may require accepting outcomes he would prefer to avoid.